All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and kick things off here. Thank you for joining this morning's webinar. My name is Farrell McKenna. I'm the head of operations here at STCR. And today I am joined by Toshiba's Paul Berry, self-checkout extraordinaire. Today's webinar has been put together with the goal of getting together a group of STCR's clients who have already made the investment in self-checkout. Today, we're joined by some fantastic grocers from all over the United States. Some are newcomers to self-checkout, some are many years veterans, and some have even just recently placed orders and are awaiting their self-checkout installs in Q1 of next year. Today, we have prepared a 1-hour session that Paul will guide us through. Paul spends a great deal of time with grocers all across the United States, helping craft and maintain their self-checkout strategies. Today, he's going to be showcasing some topics around self-checkout best practices, how to get the most utilization out of your self-checkouts, but we'll also spend some time on a topic that has risen to the level of headlines for retailers in recent months: shrink, loss prevention, and product recognition. Paul is going to give us a lens into Toshiba's roadmap in these areas and how you can leverage Toshiba's security suite to harness some of these best-in-class outcomes. Also, today's session is going to be recorded. Feel free to submit any questions that you have at any point along the way. And at the end, we're going to have a dedicated Q&A session, and I'll be able to tee those questions up for Paul. We'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of this session so that we can answer questions. And also, just as a reminder for anyone on the call, if you have not sit through a full-blown best practices session with Paul Berry and you'd like to do so, feel free to follow up with our team, and we'd be happy to arrange that for you. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and now hand the mic over to the one and only Paul Berry.
Thanks, Farrell. I appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. I appreciate you taking an hour out of your day to spend some time talking about self-checkout. I first want to say thank you. Thank you for your business. Obviously, you guys are running Toshiba products today, be it hardware, software, but I do appreciate you doing business with us, and hopefully we'll be able to do a lot more going forward. I live in North Carolina. I live in the Wake Forest area right outside of Raleigh. And like Farrell said, the exciting part about my job is I get to talk about technology with grocers across the country. So I'm not just limited geographically to, let's say, the East Coast or whatever. So I see what's going on the West Coast, East Coast, even sometimes in Canada. And I can tell you, self-checkout continues to explode, but I will tell you this. There's been a lot of mistakes made, and we're going to cover some of that here during this presentation. That way you don't step in the same holes that many other large retailers have stepped in, and hopefully we can kind of learn our lesson from some of the bigger chains, the national chains that are out there. Everything I'm going to cover, I'm going to make that available to the STCR team, so please follow up with your rep, and if you'd like a copy of the presentation, please do. But like Farrell said, what I'm going to cover is kind of the best of best practices. So there's a lot of material we don't have the time to cover today, but I can dig deeper into certain topics at a further time. So what you got to remember is when you do self-checkout, it's a journey. And if you're not constantly tweaking it as you go forward, you're gonna hit some bumps in the road. And you want to make sure that you and your staff are fully prepared to kind of execute and kind of hit on all cylinders. So with that, I'm going to turn off video because I do speak with my hands, and we're going to dive into the presentation. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about why self-service, right? Some of the lessons that have been learned over the last few years as the explosion has taken place. But you know what? You can't talk about self-service without loss prevention. So I'll talk to you about some of our latest loss prevention technologies and what's available now, what's available tomorrow type thing. And then we'll kind of dive into the best of best practices. So what are the main things you got to go focus on today, and then hopefully fine tune things. And like Farrell said, we'll kind of leave some time at the end for some Q&A. So just a couple advertisement slides. So we know self-checkout's exploding, right? You're on this call today. You probably already have self-checkout. Hopefully you do. So we know that 41% already have it. You're probably part of the 41%. 27% are either piloting or implementing, and then another 27% are even looking at it, right? Which leaves only 6% of grocers that still don't get it. And what I mean by that is they haven't had the necessary education to understand why the importance of self-checkout is there. I always like to bring grocers back to the foundation, and that is, why do we do it, right? It's not just a labor savings thing anymore, right? You want to provide another service to your customer. That's why we do self-service. We don't want to force them, right? So we want to give the shopper control of the transaction. Some of them prefer to have that. You want to give them a private checkout experience, right? Maybe personal hygiene items, things they want to buy. They don't want to go through a traditional lane. Give them the choice. And I think that's the biggest thing. And that's what larger retailers seem to forget. And that is giving your shoppers the choice to use the checkout method that they want to use. Don't force them to use it. Give them that choice to either use traditional point of sale or self-checkout of some kind, right? The other advantage is with self-checkout, we know that it absorbs those spikes on the front end that you're going to get. Sometimes you're not staffed correctly or it's snowing outside or whatever the case is. So it allows you to handle that extra spike on the front end, allowing your people to focus on store operations, other things, providing better customer service, right? So we know that your queue times will go down without increasing your labor cost. But those of you that have already implemented self-checkout, assuming you can find the labor, we know that's a challenge today. I hope that you've redirected that labor savings to the floor, to the sales floor, to the point of selection, because that's where you're going to see your biggest return on your investment is redeploying saved labor to other areas of the store to provide a better shopping experience, which is going to drive up your basket sizes in your store. And that's the goal. So I want you to think about your shoppers coming into your store today, right? They see a line forming. One of the advantages of self-checkout is queuing, right? So we know in the self-checkout world, shoppers think that if they use self-checkout, they can get in and out faster. Now we know, right, in the business, that's not true. A cashier is much faster than a shopper is. But when you have 1 to 4 queuing in this example, you have one line going in, 4 ways to get out. Versus if you look at the example on the left, you got 1-to-1 queuing, one cashier, one shopper waiting in line. So it's a series effect versus a parallel effect you get on the right-hand side. Same thing if you look at 6 lanes, right? If you look at a carousel or a courtyard of 6, you got 1 to 6. So the line is moving faster. So the perception of the shopper is you're getting through it faster. And that's the goal here is the shopper thinks that by controlling the transaction themselves, they're going to get through that transaction faster. So you can't talk about self-service without the experience, right? The key here is self-service does not mean no service. But when you look at what influences a shopper to use self-checkout in your store, you can put up all the signs you want. Unless the sign hits the shopper in the head, they're probably not going to read it, right? You can do everything you want to do, but at the end of the day, what's going to drive your shoppers to use the self-checkout is the employees inviting shoppers to use it, the experience while they're using it, and managing those queues correctly. So that's where you want to spend the bulk of your time when you implement self-checkout is making sure you got those quadrants correct. But at the same time, let's not be naive, right? Because store placement, the technology you selected, all those things play a role in it, right? But at the end of the day, those are the 3 things that are going to really drive this thing. So a lot of people say, hey, Paul, what are the trends? What's going on in the world of self-checkout? So here's what we've seen. Those early adopters that took it serious, let's say before COVID, right? Those that installed 4 are trying to go to 6, or those that installed 6 are going to 8 or 12. So they're trying to add more self-checkouts on the front end, right? Because they're really starting to do store transformation, right? We've heard some grocers, and I got some examples of this, say they're trying to go 80% self-checkout, right? Through the front end, right? You might ask, 80%, that's quite a bit, right? And they're also opening up new stores, and self-checkout is the primary way to check out in those stores. So we've seen this from Walmart. This is from June of last year. Walmart is testing out self-checkout only stores, right? We've seen Albertsons do the exact same thing. They're testing all, 100% or 80% self-checkouts. If you ever come to North Carolina, in Charlotte, a Harris Teeter, which was recently bought by Kroger a couple of years ago, they opened up a store in the Carolina area, and they converted all of their POS lanes in the Charlotte area to self-checkout. But the key is they didn't eliminate any jobs, which was good, right? So they redeployed the labor, but you got a store that's 100% self-checkout. And then we sit back and we see these news articles that we see every single day, right? My friends at STCR love to show me these things. I get them all the time. And it's true because you've read them too, right? Is self-checkout in the crosshairs? Is it on the way out, right? Is Walmart really ripping them out? Is Costco and Wegmans ripping them out, right? Is shrink going up with self-checkout? I mean, there's all these crazy news, articles coming out about, hey, is this the end of self-checkout? You know what? all these chains, especially the big ones that went overboard, right? They went too far in the implementation of self-checkout are starting to feel the wrath from their customers and from the shrink associated with it, right? So if you take a Walmart for an example, you and I both know if you go into a Walmart, you're going to see probably 12 to 18 self-checkout lanes on one end and 12 to 18 self-checkout lanes on the other end. They turn off all security on the lane, so they've opened themselves up to shrink big time, right? And then not only do that, they have one, maybe two shopper assistants to handle all of those lanes. From a best practice perspective, we say one shopper assistant, one SA, up to 6 lanes. If you go more than 6 lanes, you need another shopper assistant. That's not just to help the shopper, that's to control shrink too, right? So, when you're coming across these ads, don't think, oh, I made a wrong decision, I shouldn't have done self-checkout. You got to ask yourself, why are these things happening? Well, I'm sorry, if you do 80% self-checking on the front end, you're going to have a challenge, right? So are these stores doing that? No, but what they're doing is they're throttling back. They listen to the customer. They're bringing self-checkout counts down to give it more point of sale options. They're getting a happy medium. So, I always like to show this chart because most retailers start on the left and then they end up on the right. When you end up on the right, it doesn't mean you have to go full 80% self-checkout. What it means is every store is different based on the neighborhood that it's in. You can't do a decision chain-wide. You got to do it per store based on the geography of that store and the shoppers in that store, right? Like there's a Wegmans that opened up by me in Wake Forest about 2 years ago, and I think they have about 12 self-checkouts and 14 regular lanes. Yeah, it's a big front end, but my point is they're almost 50-50. They're not 80-20, right? Like probably a lot of them want to get there. But hopefully there's some lessons learned that we can learn from the bigger guys and kind of don't make that mistake. Don't overdo it. Again, get with STCR, get with me, and we can really talk what is the happy medium. But if you have 4 lanes today, there's nothing wrong with going to 6. If you have 6 lanes today, there's nothing wrong going to more. But you got to remember that it's one shopper assistant up to 6 lanes. If you try to stretch it more, you're going to see shrink go up and you're going to see customer service go down. So you got to balance shrink with risk there. So let's dive into loss prevention. So how do we combat that at the self-checkout line? So these are some of the things Toshiba is doing, right? Obviously, produce recognition, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk, we'll talk a little bit about item identification here. We'll show that in a couple of videos on that. But we are doing things in the lab right now to do age verification. So through some AI technology, guessing that a person's over the age of 30, let's say, and not having to do driver license checks, things like that. And also bottom of the basket, right? So if you look at our roadmap and kind of where we're building things out, we're starting with produce rec. We'll discuss that. We have an overhead loss prevention solution that looks at customer behavior. We'll show that a little bit. Our goal is to integrate those two together, right? Get all of these AI cameras talking to one another to help you combat theft at self-service. Bottom of the basket, we're not looking to identify products, but what we're looking at right now in the lab is how do you identify there is a product under the basket, forcing the shopper to acknowledge that product and to add it to their cart, right? And then the biggest thing is a camera pointing to the bagging area. We all love weight-based security, right? But how about if you tie the overhead camera with the produce rec camera with the bagging scale camera together? And at that point, when you can have a continuous flow of product, let's say from left to right, that's when you can start removing weight-based security. So that's our end game, right? That's what we're trying to get to is, okay, how do we not add more friction to the lane, but at the same time improve ability to check for shrink, right? And then last but not least is the personal video monitor. That's something that's available today, right? So again, you're showing the shopper during the transaction as kind of a theft deterrent type thing. Nobody likes to be watched, so that's just part of the arsenal that you'd look at. So let's dive into the produce recognition. So produce recognition was recently announced. I know the STCR team is hard at work getting this tested in their lab to make it available to their clients. But why did we do it, right? Can a customer walk up to the SCO lane, type in a PLU, look for a produce item on the screen? Absolutely, right? But how about if we made it easier and faster, right? How about if we're able to do that and also reduce the shrink? Because we all know that not every product has a barcode, right? Not every product may be in the quick item lookup, right? So you got to look for some of those things. So our goal with produce recognition was really to help for non-barcoded items, help for scanning errors, and really reduce the shrink, right? So basically what we've done is we've come up with a AI camera type solution, right? That's going to speed up the transaction and minimize the shrink with really good accuracy, over 90% accuracy when it comes to the produce item. The neat thing about our solution compared to other competitors out there is all of the technology is in the actual camera. So if you look at the right-hand side of the screen, you will see a Toshiba designed edge cam. So it sits on the edge of the network. All of the processing is done inside that camera. It doesn't need a room of servers to calculate what that produce item is. All of it is done right there in the camera. So the latency as far as identifying the produce item that you placed on the scale is pretty quick. Right, and I'm going to show you some examples of that. So here's kind of the way it works, right? You place the produce item on the scale, it triggers an event. We look at the product, we size it up, and then on the screen, instead of showing you multiple, let's say a page full of items, if it looks round and it's red, I'm probably going to show you some apples or some tomatoes or something like that, right? It'll limit the number of options the shopper will select from the screen from a whole page to maybe 2 or 3 or 4 at the most. And then the shopper selects it. Now you might say, well, hey, what about organics? Well, that's where when we build the model for you, if you have organics, we're going to always list the organic item next to the non-organic item on the screen to give the shopper the benefit of the doubt to select it. And what we've done from a cheaper perspective is all of the information we're gathering from clients that use our produce recognition system, all of that telemetry data of the item that's on the scanner scale, what it looked like and what the shopper selected, all that gets fed into our central cloud system, right? It all gets fed into the cloud. We analyze that data, and then about 3 to 4 times a year, we'll send down a new database of produce items that have been fine-tuned based on the history, and also add new produce items that it could not recognize, right? Because you need about 100 scans of a produce item to really nail it, what it looks like, right? And what type of product it is. So again, it's artificial intelligence, it's got some smarts, it's constantly learning, but it does require some manual intervention to tweak it as it goes through. So I'm going to show you a real live video of this. Those of you who have seen this know how good it is. So it's not just recognizing produce, it's also checking people out that are making, mistakes purposely, right? So what you're looking at the screen here is on the left-hand side of the screen is what the self-checkout screen will look like. On the top right is the actual self-checkout itself. And on the bottom right is a view of what the camera sees when you place your item on the scanner scale. So there's some audio and I'll let it run and you'll be able to watch it.
Today we're going to show you the Toshiba Produce Recognition Solution. For the demo, we're running a System 7 unit that's running our check software, along with a Toshiba Edge camera that's actually doing the computer vision algorithms on the camera itself. Let's get started. In order to enter produce using self-checkout, again, you indicate that you're entering produce. You put your item on the scale. The system recognizes the item. For items that have both organic and non-organic items, both are shown for the shopper to choose. Here, we'll select our bananas, add them to the cart. The solution also works with bags. So here we have an avocado, put in a bag, select produce recognition. The item gets recognized. We add it to our cart. We also recognize items that are in a reusable bag. So here we have oranges, put them on the scale, request the system to identify them, and it does identify the items. So the other feature of the solution is allowing the shopper to correct their own mistakes that they could have inadvertently made while shopping. So here, we'll put garlic on the scale, allow the system to identify it. Let's assume the shopper says they don't want to use that item, they want to key the PLU in themselves. They inadvertently enter the wrong item number. So what the system will do will show them exactly what the camera observes, the item they entered, and what the system selects as the actual item on the scale. Here, the shopper can easily correct their mistake and enter the correct item. Next, loss prevention in terms of customers that are not making accidental mistakes. In this example, they're trying to purchase a steak for a banana. They put the steak on the scale. enter the produce. The system does not recognize the item, so the shopper can key in their own item number. So here we're keying in bananas. The system shows what was actually on the scale, the item that the shopper entered, so they know that they've been caught. They can continue down this path and say they want to select the bananas anyway. Once they put the item in the bag, the shopper assistant is called over to be able to address the situation. Once they scan their shopper assistant card, we show the item image of the steak. We show that the shopper entered the banana, so the shopper assistant can void the item at this point in time to continue the transaction. That's Toshiba's produce recognition solution.
All right, hopefully that kind of give you a good idea of how it works and helps with shrink. I suggested to the product team that they put a picture of handcuffs on the screen during that piece, but they decided not to do that. So we took it one step further. We took produce recognition and we took it to the front end point of sale lane, right? So if you're running ACE today, the exact same thing you just seen, the exact same technology, hardware, software works on the point of sale lane. We just announced it. It'll be available at the middle of this month. The difference here is we're going to mount the camera inside of the top-down imager on a DataLogic 9800i. Now we're looking at testing it with other scanner scales, but the whole point to make the solution work well is really to have a fixed position of the camera on the lane, and that is where we decide to offer it. So if you're running ACE point of sale today, that's what we're offering. If you're running Lock SMS today, we are looking sometime next year to make the drivers and things like that available to non-Toshiba point of sale software providers, and it's up to them to really incorporate it into their offerings. So our goal is to work with Lock to see if they will support this on the SMS front end lane as well, integrating it to their software. So that's kind of the roadmap for that. But for ACE, it is available, and it'll be available here this month. So from a front end lane, what's really this time saving for the cashier, right? So we know on the left hand side of the screen, if they're recalling it from memory, it's about 6 seconds. If they scan the UPC, it's about 1.9. And you kind of go to the right hand side where Produce Rec does it in about 3.5 seconds. So the cashier will put the produce on the scanner scale, hit a button, it'll look it up, they can select it from the screen and kind of move on. So there's a time savings there for the cashier, but also it helps with loss prevention because we're making sure the cashier selects that right item. So let's look at the latest thing we just announced last week, and it's scheduled to be available the middle of this month. I heard it might slip a little bit, but I would imagine sometime in the first quarter, STCR will have this available to you. So this is the next phase. This is the top-down view of the shopper's behavior. So what is this camera doing? This camera is looking down onto the SCO lane. There's a camera inside the transaction awareness light that you would mount. And it's not only looking at the SCO lane, what you're placing on the scanner scale, but it's looking around the SCO lane as well to see what the movement behavior is. And what it's trying to catch is a shopper that is taking an item out of their cart and not scanning it and placing it in the bagging area or placing it back in their cart. So as I play these next 4 clips, I want you to pay attention to the upper left-hand side of the window, and you're gonna see in red, miss scan, and that's when the camera up above saw the miss scan. So what happens is, as it sees the miss scan, if the shopper doesn't correct it on the screen, it'll show them a replay of the video that you're looking at right here. It'll show them a replay of what they've done. And if the shopper doesn't correct it, the shopper assistant will come over and view that same video and fix the intervention that occurred. So let's play this first video. So this person is taking the item out. He fakes like he scans it, looks around, nope, throws it in the bag, and it flagged it as a miss scan. So if I look at the next one on the right-hand side, she scanned it. You know what? Let me put it back in the cart. Let me go take this yogurt, put it right in the bagging area, and you see it flagged it as a misscan. So it's pretty good at what it does. It's really watching that shopper behavior. This one, she just bypasses it altogether, and it'll show them a misscan. So we'll kind of go a little bit further on this one. Takes an item, throws them right into the bag, I believe, if I remember right. Doesn't need to scan them, right? Misscan. So you kind of see how it catches those shoppers do those different things. And the one on the right is pretty good. Scans an item, everything's going well. Here's a nice hat. I'll just think I'll wear it. I don't need to put it in the bag. I don't need to scan it. And it flagged it. So it's funny, the proof of concepts that we did with some of these technologies, the grocer said, yeah, we don't have a shrink problem, until we showed them they had a shrink problem, and then they realized that they really did. So again, using AI technology to help with that. Some of the other things from a loss prevention perspective is I talked earlier on about the personal video monitor. So this is a camera that you can mount on top of your self-checkout screen. It requires additional software if you want to show the shopper's face on the touch screen itself. Another alternative is the one in the middle, the one on the right. You can just work with STCR for a third-party camera and LCD screen to mount to the transaction awareness light, kind of showing the shopper shopping. Whether you want to record or not is really your choice. So that's some of the things we're doing in loss prevention. More to come. Like I said, some of these things are currently in flight. We're working on it, but we're paying attention big time on where we need to improve some of those things. So let's dive into self-checkout best practices. So if you've seen me do a recent best practice presentation that takes roughly about an hour to hour and a half, I came up with a top 10 list. At the end of the presentation, people say, what affects SCO utilization? What is SCO utilization to begin with? When I say the word SCO utilization, that implies what percentage of your transactions are going through your self-checkout lanes, right? Not revenue, but transactions. And if you have about 4 lanes in your store, self-checkout lanes, you want to get about 35% of your transactions going through those lanes. How do you know what that number is? We have reporting that will tell you what the number is, but that's the ultimate goal. So the challenge is what affects the SCO utilization is mistakes, right? You know, if you remember the old David Letterman top 10 list, right? Basically, there's 10 items I feel that can cause it. You know, selecting the wrong shopper assistant, management not embracing SCO. The list goes on and on and on. So I'm going to kind of peel back the onion on each one of these, and we're going to talk a little bit about what you can do, right? What you can do to improve on each one of those. So the first one is selecting the wrong shopper assistant, the wrong SA. What is the SA's role? The SA's role is not to hide behind the podium, right, which we call a vacation station. If you have a podium, make sure it's pushed off to the side. You have a regular point of sale lane there. It's to handle exceptions that can't be done at the SCO lane. Maybe you need to transfer an order. Maybe somebody brought a check, things like that. That's the purpose of the podium. It's not for the shopper assistant to stand there checking their Facebook status, right? You want them working with the shopper at the lane. They are your first line of defense. They need to be helping the shopper, supervising the lanes. When an intervention occurs, they have a shopper assistant card that only they have. They don't share it because now through the reporting, you can track everything they've done when that card was scanned, right? All that good stuff is there. They're there to monitor body language, monitor the lane lights, listen to the audio prompts if they're turned on. Why is that important? Well, if you hear bananas too many times, you know something's going on. But the best form of loss prevention you can have at your self-checkout lanes is a simple, hi, my name is Paul. Please let me know if you need any assistance. I'll be right over here. I've talked to the shopper. I've looked at them eye to eye. The chances of them stealing from me at self-checkout are slim to none, right? So make sure your shopper assistant is doing their job. They want to greet every shopper, encourage them how to use it. Again, assume they learned the wrong way at the local store down the street, your competitor. Maybe they don't operate SCO the same way you do. Answer any questions to remove fear. Educate them what happened when something went wrong, right? You're there to educate the shopper how it works in your store. They need to manage the traffic flow, and they need to really monitor the customer's body language to see when they're frustrated. We know the rule of 20. Within 20 seconds, if a shopper doesn't get help, they're going to take their stuff, go to another SCO lane. They're going to take their stuff, go to a man lane. They're going to take their stuff and walk out the door, or just leave their stuff and walk out the door. So you got to really make sure the shopper assistant is there. When they're not extremely busy, that's when they need to help the shoppers, right? You know, assume they don't know exactly everything they're doing correctly in your store. Be there to help the shopper get through the transaction, answer questions. Sometimes the elderly may prefer you to scan it for them as they're getting started. Then they'll kind of learn it and do it on their own as they go forward. When they're not busy, they need to keep the lane clean, right? It's a customer-facing device. So make sure the screens are clean, the scanner scales are clean, make sure everything's working correctly, the bags are refilled. These next 2 pages, I'm not going to dig in too much, but this is kind of a checklist, right? A summation checklist. So when you go back to your store, look at the shopper assistant, ask yourself, are they doing these things? There's probably about 15 different items on these next 2 pages, but are they really doing these things? Do they want to be there? Do they have the right personality? A lot of people say, Paul, I'm going to put my best cashier there. I'm like, don't put your best cashier there. Put the person in the store that has the best personality, that can multitask. And I hate to say it, right? Sometimes the older the person is, the better off they are as a shopper assistant, because they probably want to be there. They don't have to be there, and they're just focused on it. So I've seen, the elderly people do a much better job at managing self-checkout than some of the younger crowd that really aren't focused on it, right? So kind of think of the demographics for that. But these are 2 pages that you can kind of go through and make sure that you're kind of on track to do it. So let's keep going. Management not embracing SCO. What does that mean? I like to think of it as a cancer. If you have one person in the organization or at the store that is negative about self-checkout, you're going to fail. You've got to address it head on. So to be successful at self-checkout, you got to have effective planning. You got to communicate and be committed to best practices, and you got to have support from all levels of management. So it really starts at the top down. You got to drive it through the organization. The biggest mistake I see people make is they make self-checkout decisions, and if they're large enough as a company, they don't include key people like their loss prevention person, right? Or they don't include some of the operation people, things like that. Then they wonder why they have problems. Well, they need to be part of this whole process so they understand how it works, why it works, and how do you make it work correctly. So again, make sure all levels of management understand it. Make sure you're setting the right tone, and make sure you have, somebody monitoring those self-checkouts to see how they're working in that store, right? And I'm gonna say store, because at the end of the day, you have to do this per store, not just at a chain-wide basis. So is SCO ready for your store? I don't know, right? These are the questions you got to ask yourself, and I dig deeper into all these during standard best practice training, right? But do all employees understand why you've implemented self-checkout for your store? Do they understand it? Do they feel threatened? Maybe it's a job threat because you're trying to save labor, things like that. You don't know, right? Have management taken the time to address the concerns of those people, right? Have you gone through your store and checked for any red flags, things that would cause friction at the self-checkout lane, right? Things that don't have a barcode, that are not in the quick item lookup, right? Does every employee know their role? I didn't say shopper assistant. I said, does every employee know their role? I'll give you an example. This was probably 2 years ago. I was up in Minnesota. I was watching the installers install some SCO lanes. I was talking to the business partner I was with over there at the time. And I remember a shopper walked up to one of the people on the front end, wasn't a shopper assistant, wasn't a cashier, just an employee at the front end. And that gentleman said, so those are taken jobs, aren't they? And that lady turned to that shopper and said, sir, they are not taking jobs. We can't find labor. Did you see the help wanted sign in the window? Would you like an application, right? So my point is, that employee was trained how to address concerns of the shopper. Because if you don't think your shoppers may be a little irritated or intimidated by self-checkout in your store, they are. So you want to make sure that all your employees know how to communicate to those shoppers. And here's probably the biggest mistake, okay? Then I should make it flash in red, that retailers do, and you've probably done the same thing if you have multiple stores, is you do all your homework for the first store, right? You go through best practice training, you implement, you work hard with STCR to get the store trained on everything. Everything's rocking and rolling. You're having good success in the store. And now you're going to put SCO in the next store and then the next store. So what you do is you order the SCOs for the store, the next store. You take the shopper assistant that you're going to have for store number 2. You send them to store number 1. They shadow the existing shopper assistant. They know what they're doing. They go back to store number 2, and then you go live with SCO. And then you wonder why you don't get the SCO utilization like you're getting in the first store. It's pretty simple. The only person that knows how to manage it is a shopper assistant. You haven't explained it to any of the other employees. And if you remember what drives SCO utilization, that's employees inviting shoppers to use it, right? So you've got to go to every store and make sure every employee in that store understands why we're doing SCO, right? Choice, conveniency, privacy, all those good things. You got to get them geared up for it, so those employees of store number 2 don't feel threatened like the people at store 1 did before you ease their concerns, right? Again, make sure you're duplicating this for every single store. All right, what else affects SCO utilization? Well, not removing express lanes, keeping POS lanes open with no lines forming, right? Opening POS lanes away from self-checkout lanes, locating lanes at the far end next to exit doors like Walmart does, right? Not selecting the right mix of cash versus card only lanes. I love to see that one. And then the shopper assistant not performing proper queue management. So we're going to dig into a couple of these things, right? But those of you that want to save $1 and mix cash with card, you can do that. You will save $1, but I'll tell you, you're going to generate major friction for your shoppers and frustration for your shoppers if you're managing your self-checkouts correctly. And I'll talk about that here in a minute. So location-wise, the best scenario is if you can have the lanes facing each other, right, in a courtyard environment, 2 facing 2, 3 facing 3 type things. You want to make sure you're positioning the lanes so the shopper would see them or have to walk past them to get to a traditional lane. That's why you don't want to shove them all the way on the end, especially the wrong end, right? So make sure they're visible. You've got to remove express lanes. Express lanes compete with self-checkout lanes because think about it. Self-checkout is express. You want to get in and get out. You're in a hurry. If you have express lanes, that's going to take business away from that. Really, the only exception might be the service counter. So you got to think about some of those things, right? If you can, place it as close to the center of the front end that you can, because that's going to help with queue management, which I'll talk about here in a minute. Keep them away from exit doors. The environmental things in your store will drastically affect how self-checkout performs. If you have wind coming in from the outside, if you have air curtains on your doors, if you have HVAC vents blowing down on it, if you have merchandise racks rubbing up against the SCO lane, you're going to have weight security errors. So make sure the placement is correct. If you want to put the odds in your favor, put them in the center. And make sure you never put anything on the same circuit as the SCO lane, right? Coolers, space heaters. I can't tell you how many things I've been pulled into in the last couple of months where the security scale was not working correctly or we're getting too many interventions. Well, you know what? They got space heaters hooked into the same circuit, right? Or the cooler kicks on and then draws power and messes up the SCO lane. So again, they've got to be on a dedicated circuit. As far as placement goes, you want to surround the lane with merchandise racks, right? So here's an example. You got them in the middle. You got merchandise racks forming one line going in. Now imagine if you're doing this correctly with one line going in and you're a cash paying customer and you're next in line, but the next available SCO lane is a card only machine. What are you gonna do? Say, come around, right? Or worse yet, not offer cash to anybody and now they can't do cash back and now you've taken that choice away, right? So if you have 20 to 25% of your shoppers that pay with cash, guess what? You've turned away 20 to 25% of those shoppers to use SCO, and those shoppers that pay with cash are probably express shoppers anyway, so they want to get it out. So again, you're removing that capability from your stores. So why is queue management so important? Why did I say open lanes next to self-checkout lanes? Because here's the deal. What causes people to use self-checkout, right, besides just having the option because they want to, is they don't want to wait in line, right? Nobody wants to wait in line. So by having lines form at the lanes next to self-checkout, the people waiting in line can lean over, right, because there's low merchandise racks and see there's availability at self-checkout. And if the shopper assistant was doing their job, they'd be at the front inviting shoppers to come use it, right? So what you want to do is break down those lines and invite shoppers to use it. So you start opening lanes next to self-checkout and then tiering outward towards the end, right? If you open, let's say lane 6 on this page, shoppers waiting in line there will never see what's going on in self-checkout because it's too far, nor is the shopper assistant going to go grab them. Here's a couple courtyard examples. Again, the only thing missing here, this is right after they did the install, was merchandise racks forming one line going in and then merchandise racks surrounding the lanes for impulse items. So again, you got to have merchandise racks there, but this is perfect in the middle. They put it in front of customer service. That's a plus. But again, perfect layout. Here's a shopper. I'm not going to tell you where they're at, but they're in the US. I came up with a layout in a courtyard environment for 6 lanes. And here's what they did. They took my design. They said, you know, we're going to tweak it. We're going to put 20 feet in between the lanes. And then they wonder why the SCO utilization is in the tank and the shopper assistant keeps those lanes on the far end closed because they don't want to keep running back and forth, because this is what I recommended. I don't think you see 20 feet in between these SCO lanes. You see about 2 to 2.5 feet in between them. So again, the retailer didn't take the advice and they went out and did their own thing. And then they wonder why they're having challenges. And now they've paid us to come back and do it correctly for them. But here's the whole goal with this one is, right, one line going in, one line going out, nice flow. Everybody kind of gets through there. All right, I know I'm going quick. Not reviewing boss reports, back office system server, and talking to the shopper assistant. I can walk into your store and in 30 minutes, I can tell you why your SCO utilization is affected just by looking at what's going on in the self-checkout area. And a lot of that has to do with monitoring the reports from your BOSS system in the back room, right? It's where you set up your shopper assistant IDs, all that good stuff. But the point here is you want to look at the reports. The reports are key. It's going to show you your average usage, your basket size, your security reports, your top 25 reports, right? Your goal, again, should be about 35% of those transactions going through the self-checkout. So if you're looking at the reports, you're going to like your results because you're going to see what's going on in your store, and then you can work with STCR to help fine-tune certain things. So, I like to say if you're running self-checkout and you're not paying attention to the reports, at least weekly, if not, or monthly, right? If you're not paying attention to them, it's like trying to fly a 747 without instruments. You're going to crash. And that's the same thing here is if you're not looking at these BOSS reports or have somebody monitoring them, you're really not going to know what's going on, right? Plus, you can use the BOSS reports. We have some training classes from a forensic analysis perspective. What I mean by that is, you know what? Employees steal too, right? I think you know that. And they don't have to just steal at the POS lane. They can steal at SCO as well. If you're giving them the authorization to void items and things like that, you're opening yourself up to theft at the self-checkout as well. And these reports will help you diagnose which shopper assistant may be taking advantage of the situation based on the number of voids they did or cancels they did or things like that, just by paying attention to those reports. All right, here's my last slide. We talk to retailers all the time, and we ask them, if you were going to talk to a new SCO retailer that was getting ready to launch into the SCO realm, what would you give them? What advice would you give them? They basically said, make sure you're following best practices and policies, right? That support the customer environment, right? Your success really depends on the shopper assistant. That SA's got to be key, right? Interventions, you got to take care of those interventions. Make sure you got the right person doing that, right? Encourage shoppers to use SCO, but don't force them. Don't do like the Lowe's and the Home Depots of the world and only open up SCO at certain times of the day. Don't force them to use it. Give them the option to use it. And if you're doing it right, you're going to see a line at self-checkout and no line at your traditional lane. I'll guarantee you'll see that often in your stores. Don't adjust labor before usage develops. Again, don't shock the system. Let things happen, right? We talked about this. Great customer service works as theft deterrent. Absolutely. If you're being talked to, the person's not going to steal from you. So you can't ratchet down the security on these lanes so tight where you have major friction to solve for the 1% of the people that are going to try to steal from you there, right? You got to have somebody there working with them. And again, don't base your whole labor savings or your whole business case on labor savings. You got to look at the choice that you gave your shoppers on that. So with that, I am done. I went pretty quick, but I left about 15 minutes for Q&A. So Farrell, I'll turn it back over to you.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Paul. Thank you very much for going through all that
Sure.
awesome content. So a couple questions have come in, and as always, feel free to anyone on the call here, start submitting any questions that you have in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom. So Paul, first question. You talked about some large retailers implementing self-checkout poorly. Is there a good example of a notable retailer who has executed self-checkout flawlessly and you would consider to be the gold standard?
Yeah, no, I would say Wegmans, right? Wegmans does a phenomenal job with self-checkout. They understand early on the importance of the shopper assistant and making sure you have adequate ratio between shopper assistant and self-checkout lanes. So most of you are probably up in the Northeast. You got a lot of Wegmans up there compared to what we have here in the Southeast. But I would go watch at a Wegmans. Again, this was a retailer that's only focused, that their main focus was self-service. Was customer service, and they did not want to do self-service because they felt that self-service meant no service, and they're early adopter. They tried it in the prepared food areas. They had great success. So now they went to the front end. So like I said, the store next to me is almost 50-50, but I would go in there and watch how they're doing it. And they've been, believe it or not, they've been our proof of concept guinea pig for produce recognition and that overhead loss prevention solution that I showed you. We have it running here at the Wegmans store close to our headquarters in Cary, North Carolina. And they've been instrumental in working with us to fine tune the screens and that whole algorithm, right? And they've done a really good job with how they've done self-checkout. So if I had to guess from a well-known chain, that would probably be the one I would look at. Good question.
All right. Great. Thanks, Paul.
Yep.
Next question here. How does the self-checkout handle organic produce? What options are there to flag within the self-checkout that it is organic?
So we all know organic has a different PLU, right? So you, from an operational perspective, when you're setting up your self-checkout, if you're not using produce recognition, for example, you want to make sure that on the screen, next to every standard product that has an organic product, the organic product is right next to it and it says organic on the button. That's the objective. So you have, so if let's say bananas, you're going to have 2 bananas, right? One 4011, one 94011. So they're going to be side by side. That way you're giving the customer the benefit of the doubt to select the organic one. Now, if they want to cheat the system, they can do that, right? That's what the shopper assistant's job is to really hover and monitor what's going on at the self-checkout. The other thing is we've seen some retailers as a best practice, right, is, and I know this is extra work, right? But maybe taking 3 different organic peppers, doing an overwrap and putting a barcode on the bottom so they can scan it, right? Just doing other types of things to manage that. If you're running produce recognition, the same approach is it's going to show all the time the regular product and the organic product next to it, right? So it's going to let you see those 2 on the screen so you pick the right one. The other thing I would always do is have an organics tab on the quick item lookup screen. So, you know, you probably seen the alphabet where you can hot key it to another screen, but, you know, right up at the front, left-hand side, have an organics tab. So now you're giving that shopper multiple choices to use to select the right option if they truly want to be truthful. And that's the only thing you can really do from an organic perspective.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, this customer did follow up and clarify and said he meant produce recognition, and I think you
Okay.
touched on that.
Yep.
Okay. Lots of grocers are investing in mobile operations manager for handling interventions on the self-checkout. What would you say at a high level are the best practices around implementing that successfully?
Yeah, so we're renaming Mobile Operation Manager. We're calling it Mobile Assist. So if you have Mobile Operation Manager, those of you that don't know what it is, so it's a piece of software that runs on a mobile device, a handheld device, a little bit bigger than a phone, let's say a Zebra device, for example. And it's as if you were standing in front of the self-checkout. The same screens you would see on the self-checkout, you'd see on the Mobile Operation Manager. So what that allows you to do is clear interventions remotely, okay? The one thing I don't like about Mobile Operation Manager is the retailer that decides to use that device instead of having a shopper assistant going to the lane and helping the shopper get through the intervention. So an example, somebody creates an intervention. This is the shopper assistant's opportunity to go to the lane and explain to the person, you know, ma'am or mister, you know, this is a weighted area where the bags go. So your children can't play in the area, or you must scan your item first to put it in the area, or you need to remove your umbrella or your purse from the area because it's a weighted security scale. But instead, the person with the Mobile Operation Manager device sees the intervention, sees what the shopper did, and clears your intervention remotely with the device, never walking over to the lane to educate the consumer. So the goal with Mobile Operation Manager is not to have it be a crutch so you can clear things remotely, maybe from the service counter, right? But it's really there to assist in the operation. So maybe you're going to check an ID and you can do it remotely because you see the person's got a little bit of gray hair, right? Those are certain things you can use that Mobile Operation Manager to do. Maybe you don't have a hand scanner on the lane to scan bulk items, which we always recommend, but you can use that Mobile Operation Manager to scan that bulk item that's under the basket and add it to the transaction. So there are some really good use cases for it. But what you don't want to do is have that eliminate the shopper assistant from going to the lane to help the shopper. And that's the key. You want to provide customer service at the SCO lane and not hide behind a screen somewhere else.
Thanks, Paul.
All right. Yep.
Going back to the organic question,
Okay.
is there any way to sticker items that are organic and have it show up automatically?
Sticker items that are so I'll give you an example. Albertsons out west, they bought Safeway. They created an organic sticker that they place on all of their organic items. So when you go to the self-checkout lane, in the example I gave you before, whether it was produce rec or non-produce rec, when it shows the picture of the item on the quick lookup screen, it shows the regular item, and then the button next to it, instead of saying the word organic on it, it shows the picture of that sticker. So they kind of marry the two together. That's what Albertsons has done to help, ensure people are handling organics. There's no automated way. Again, sometimes it's hard to distinguish between the two. That's why we always show both, right? I don't know if I'm doing a good job answering that question or not.
Another follow-up question from the same customer. We were planning to put colored bands around our organic produce. Would that work?
Like a green band. I know from a produce recognition perspective, it learns as it goes, right? So being that it can identify things through bags, it will identify the green band. The challenge with that is we will have to have enough sampling of that produce wrapped with the green band for the produce rec to identify it, to show it on the screen. So it's not going to happen on day one, but the more it's used by yourself and other retailers that are kind of doing the same thing, the more it'll give us a good sampling of that, and then we'll add it to the master model file that has all the produce in it. So again, it's going to get smarter as time goes on. But yeah, I mean, organics is a challenge. It's a challenge for your cashiers too, right? So you just got to hope that the shopper's giving you the benefit of the doubt and picking the right thing.
Thank you, Paul.
Yep.
Is there any data on the video streaming reducing shrink? I think this is referencing the streaming of the customer on the screen.
You talking about the overhead camera or the PVM camera that's showing the shopper?
The showing the shopper.
Yeah, we don't have any data that says if you're showing the shopper as they're shopping, your shrink's going to go down by X. We don't have any data like that. It's more of a psychological thing, right? As we do best practices for self-checkout, we always recommend, best case, have the camera on the screen. Worst case, have an overhead camera showing all of the lanes in the self-checkout area with a big display where people can see they're being watched. I mean, at the end of the day, people get intimidated when they're being monitored and watched, and most of the time they're not going to steal. But at the end of the day, if someone wants to steal, they're going to steal from you. Either they're going to steal at self-checkout, they're going to steal in the aisle. They're going to steal, and that's just the nature of the business we're in. Yeah, there's only so much you can do, but yeah, we don't have any data that says you're going to see X% shrink if you show the shopper while they're shopping.
Thank you. I do have another question here. Again, feel free to submit any questions in the Q&A function, but Paul, this may be the last one here.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on the dual use lanes that can be either a register or a self-checkout that are implemented in certain parts of the country?
Yeah, okay. The best question for last. Okay, I'll give you Paul's opinion of the use lane, and I'll tell you what I've heard from my peers, right, that work with the clients that have them. We have, I want to say 3 or 4 clients that have done dual use lanes. It depends why you're doing them, right? So those customers of ours that implemented dual use lane, they wanted to advertise all lanes open all the time, right? So by doing that, if you have a dual use lane, you can advertise all lanes open all the time. And that's fine and dandy from an advertisement perspective, but from an operational perspective, it's a disaster. And here's the reason why. If you look at some of the examples I gave you of monitoring self-checkout utilization through proper queue management, right? That's a quarter of the throughput. Having one shopper assistant be able to manage 4 to 6 lanes, right? That implies that the self-checkout lanes are in a courtyard of 4 or a courtyard of 6, and you can do that. When you start going to a dual use lane environment, your lane is as long as a traditional point of sale lane. So you can no longer put them in a courtyard environment. Now you have a full-blown lane there. And when they're open up in self-service mode, think about your shopper assistant. How can they adequately run back and forth on the front end, managing those dual use lanes when they're in self-checkout mode, right? There's other operational issues you start to have. And one of them is people run out of places to put bags because it's a big machine, and they start placing their bags on, it's hard to show you without a picture, but in the area where a cashier would have put them, right? And now they're not on the weight security scale. So now they're causing weight security issues, right? And the other thing you got to think about is it requires a software change, right? So depending on what software you're running, right? I know if you're running ACE today, we've done that conversion, and it was a very expensive conversion in the tune of 6 figures. If you're running Lock SMS, we haven't even touched that with Lock SMS and how to do a conversion on that, because basically you're flipping from point of sale to self-checkout, and it's 2 really different sets of software that you got to operate. So I think the moral of the story is, why do you want to do it? Why do you think it's good for you? And then let's sit down and talk about operationally, how would you handle it? Because those retailers that have done it, what we found is they either keep them in self-service all the time or cashier mode all the time. And your ROI goes, you blow it out of the water, right? Because it doesn't make any sense when you do one or the other. It's either a very expensive point of sale lane, or it's a very inefficient self-checkout lane, because if you look at, it's like a belted self-checkout lane. It takes up too much room, right? You see them at Walmart because they got 1,000 lanes on the front end, but you try to do it in a grocery that's got 6 or 8 or 10 lanes on the front end. Now you're taking up a whole lane with a belt, which makes no sense. So if you look at self-checkout, a self-checkout lane's about 70% throughput efficient compared to a point of sale lane operating at 100%. So if your self-checkout lane takes the space of a full point of sale lane, you're only getting 70% throughput in that real estate in your store, versus if you had 2 self-checkout lanes in that space, now you got 70 plus 70 is 140% throughput, which is faster than 1 point of sale lane at 100%. I know I'm trying to explain something that a chart would show it better, but the net of it is, it's a very expensive proposition to go dual use. Those retailers that have done it are thinking twice about it. I heard one of them is actually decommissioning the lanes. They're going back to traditional self-checkouts. But again, if you want to advertise all lanes open all the time, and you're willing to take up the real estate, and you're going to use them 50% of the time for POS, 50% for SCO, go for it. But you're not going to see the throughput as if you had more self-checkout lanes. So that's a long answer for that question, but I get that quite often, along with belted lanes as well.
Got it. All right. Well, appreciate the insight, Paul.
Okay.
I think that's a wrap for today.
Right.
So thank you so much, Paul, for sharing your presentation today and best practices. And thank you to everyone who joined today. Within the next 24 hours, we're going to be sending out the recording for this. And also, if you like these sorts of things, we're going to continue our monthly Lunch and Learn series into 2024. So look for more topics next year, such as this, and we'll be publishing that calendar in the next couple of weeks. But as always, thank you again for tuning in.
All right.
Have a
Thank
good
you
day.
all. Hopefully y'all have a happy holiday. Bye-bye.
Bye.